Hi, thank you for having me at this conference. I am also thankful for Grinnell College and the city of Grinnell and supporting me in completing this case study that I'm going to be presenting to you today. Um, and thank you for attending and listening in and providing your feedback and thoughts and the conversation that we have on regards to this subject. So I'm going to be presenting on native plantings as solutions to community issues and the case study that I've drawn up related to it. There's ample evidence that native plants have a variety of benefits to health, ecology, and finances. All these benefits lead one to ask the question, how can we use native plants as a tool to serve communities across these intersectional benefits? This case study analyzes those benefits that native plants could bring to the city of Grinnell. So the city of Grinnell is made up of nearly 10,000 residents. And then when you include the college campus that is residential in the city of about 1,700 students, we get really close to just over that 10,000 mark. It is right along Interstate 80, which travels across the continental US from coast to coast. And it has its own hospital, has a regional airport. It is the largest city within Powesheet County where it lies, and is within a couple miles of Jasper County. So it is a larger city for the rural landscape that it lies in. It's surrounded by agricultural land, including confined animal feeding operations. And it's within about an hour drive to the east of Iowa City, or excuse me, an hour drive east to Iowa City and west to Des Moines, which is Iowa's capital. So what are native plants, to be sure that we're all working off the same definition? A plant that is a part of the balance of nature that has developed over hundreds or thousands of years in particular region or ecosystem, according to the Natural Resource Conservation Service. And when we're thinking about native plants, we want to make sure that we are thinking about the geographic qualifier. For instance, these plants are native to New England or something to that effect. And the Natural Resource Conservation Service notes that when they're thinking about this, they are thinking about native plants as the plants that were found here before European settlement. So what are the ecological benefits that native plants can generally provide? They often align with the climate in a particular location, which means that they can handle the weather conditions that they're going to experience. They usually enhance infiltration of water and then hold water in that soil, whatever kind of soil they've developed in. They can usually withstand drought periods relative to non-native plants and require less special care during those kind of situations. They support native pollinators because they have evolved in conjunction with one another, which is critical to many agricultural products, and then also support native animals. They provide a diversity of viewing pleasure and add beauty to gardens, while also requiring less care once they're established relative to non-native plants. And over the long term, because of the reduction in care needed, there's a reduction in fuel use necessary, which is a reduction in carbon dioxide emissions and the costs that are company fuel use and machines use. And labor costs. So with the reduction of those, the use of machines, you also end up having a reduction in noise pollution. Usually fewer and no fertilizers and pesticides are necessary. And on top of that, when chemicals are used around native plantings, they actually reduce the amount of runoff from those pollutants. The reduction of machines being used also improves air quality, as we know that those two-cycle engines are some of the worst polluters relative to other machines. And then some store carbon better than manicured lawn, and the evidence is growing of that for a variety of native plants. So what are the financial benefits? So measured against the damage that certain non-native plants and invasive species, including animals. There's one study that indicated that the state of Oregon is spending upwards of $125 million a year on fighting these kind of non-native and invasive species in order to keep up manicured spaces. And then with a small change in native vegetation, from manicured lawn, we see a disproportionate positive return on wildlife for the investment that has been made. And then Applied Ecological Services did a study of larger properties where it is estimated over a 20-year period. The cumulative cost of maintaining a prairie or a wetland totaled around $3,000 per acre versus $20,000 per acre for non-native turf grass. So, how is this related to the city of Grinnell? So the city of Grinnell has just over 400 manicured acres. This is probably a slightly low estimate because it only takes into account the major spaces that are named. No doubt there are plenty of other spaces that aren't named that would increase the acreage. So the estimated cost of putting in native plants on these 400 some acres would be about $60,000, close to $61,000 versus nearly $445,000 for non-native turf grass if we're using those numbers that were suggested by the study referenced on the previous slide. The actual city of Grinnell reports a cost of over $132,250 per year to keep up their non-native turf grass, which is a huge difference between $445,000. One reason that we could assume that this is explained is because of we live in a low-cost area, being rural. But then we could also wonder, would there be significantly lower cost for implementing non-native plants as well because of reduction in labor costs and things that align with the reduction of labor costs for manicured lawns. The other reason that it's quite a bit lower is that the city of Grinnell's report of these numbers acknowledges that it doesn't actually include every single cost that is associated with keeping their manicured lawns on the city spaces. And so we can assume that it is a higher cost. But if we are going to go ahead and use these numbers that we do have a bit of certainty over, we have a $71,590 difference in those conservative estimates between the cost of probably implementing native plants and the cost that the city is actually experiencing right now. Now, we can also acknowledge that we're probably not going to convert 100% of all of the green space, the turf space that Grinnell currently has. And so are we going to convert 80, 50, or 20%? But for ease of numbers and figures right now, if we were to convert 100%, it would be a $1.5 million savings over 20 years. We use that 20-year number because some of the studies are based off of that timeline, and it aligns with the number of years that are required to get a native plants started and then maintained, and then also the cost savings to be measured out over that time about machines and labor costs and all that. So if we look at that 20-year timeline, really what we're talking, or even in a single year, what we're talking about is a 0.02% of an annual $300 million city budget. This is seemingly small, of course, obviously, but what isn't also taken into account, aside from the costs that the city acknowledges aren't in these numbers, is that we are probably increasing the water holding capacity of these spaces, the biodiversity, the unique tourist draw that would exist relative, and as we look at other communities around our area, the kind of flowers and plantings that draw tourists in. Potentially greater community engagement, which I'll get into further along in this presentation, and potential increase in property values. The one thing that I do want to mention here is that there was one study that aligns with anecdotal evidence from our community as well as plenty of others, that there's a fear amongst a quarter of Europeans who were surveyed in one study that these kind of natural areas won't be properly maintained, and comparing that to manicured lawns. So what are the problems facing the city of Grinnell? According to our city manager, as well as leading employers, presidents and deans of local colleges, the school district superintendent, people representing large constituent groups in our community. Population loss is a concern. Lack of affordable housing is a concern. Limited private capital and the expertise to manage that capital, and then declining civic engagement. So how do native plantings relate to these problems? There is that small financial benefit that I pointed out. And while it seems like a very small number, if we're looking at the kind of financial capital that is needed for some businesses in Grinnell to start in our small community, a $70,000 investment managed by the city to a small business could be a huge impact. And even if we were to divide that up in half, thirds, quarters, that could still be a significant input to a small business in Grinnell that may be able to employ individuals. And so it could have a big impact in a community as small as ours. The conservation practices, including native plantings, may increase home values, as has been demonstrated in the intentional community setup, where native plantings were part of conservation practices in what the intentional community of Prairie Crossing. It led to increased home values relative to similar neighborhoods that were right close by Prairie Crossing. Would this make more capital available for investment? Possibly, with increased home values and more finances available to individuals in Grinnell, but it would also reduce affordability potentially. So an uncertainty about that. Will it increase civic engagement? I mentioned Prairie Crossing. They had evidence in their community, again, relative to communities that were nearby, that demonstrated increased civic engagement in their community. However, this is a correlative statistic. There was no evidence of what caused the civic engagement, but again, Prairie Crossing was designed to be an intentional community around conservation practices, with a major aspect of it being native plantings in that community. And so, is there some reason that this kind of community that is surrounded by native plantings encourages civic engagement? Now, we aren't even taking into account here with solid numbers, as I've alluded to, the potential savings from reduced impacts of flooding and other costs associated with increased severe weather events, as climate change is going to continue to worsen as it is impacting us already. And so will that potentially increase financial availability of finances in our city by saving us with these native plantings? So we can conclude here, and to wrap up, and what I've pointed out thus far is that there are limited impact of finances, but there is still potential impact. There is uncertainty about the impact on home values, but there is some evidence that it may have a positive impact. And there is also uncertainty about that impact of civic engagement. But again, we have some evidence that it could have an impact. And finally, Grinnell has not found solutions to these problems that they've been trying to address for decades. And so we have some evidence that this could have an impact, and we have yet to try it in Grinnell. So it might be worth considering implementing this idea of planting native plants to see how it would impact these various aspects of our community. Thanks for listening. I really look forward to hearing your thoughts on this issue, even though I haven't given you a clear answer to what you were probably coming to find out here, about like, how can we use native plants to have an impact? But at least we'll have a start with our conversation. Enjoy the rest of the conference.